Yeah, I think definitely not enough, I would say, in hindsight, right? So I could have been more proactive about marketing at that time, but I wasn't. I think at the time I was more like build it and they will come, which, doesn't really work that way. Like you do have to tell people that you exist. And so I think there was some inbound, right? But that was really mainly out of not necessarily people I knew directly, but people that the people I knew, right? So there was some level of basic word of mouth just from being in the tech industry and, people saying, hey, you have Postgres problems, go take a look at this product. But I think it definitely took a while. So I can't recount exactly when we got to the first 10, but it must have been, over a year, I imagine, until we actually, from we put the payment form in to actually having 10 customers. One thing that I found interesting though, is that I didn't know these customers, right? So I think one thing that, not directly, I knew them indirectly probably, but there weren't people that I told, hey, please sign up for this. And, I have this precious business that I spent so much time on, please, be nice to me. I didn't do that, right? Like I was just like, here's something that's useful. If you find it useful yourself, then go ahead and use it. And I think that has been a very good starting point because it essentially like I listened to what people were saying, but it was always a little bit, removed from people that I knew directly. And I think that helped me kind of cultivate also a culture of like later on, as we're talking about hundreds of customers, right? Like really being more about, what's the pattern we're seeing here? Like what do these people actually want versus, them just being nice to me because they, wanted to support my business.
So how were they finding the product? Was it just SEO or?
So I remember we did some talks at like user groups, right? So like this, Postgres is an open source project, right? And so I think I recall, like I had a friend of mine who I was starting things with back then, who's no longer with the company, but back then he was, I think, doing some talks at user groups. And so I think some of that was inbound from that. And he was also doing some consulting in the space. So I think it might have been consulting clients or people that he knew through that as well.
So 2014, people can pay for it. You said about a year to get the first 10 customers. How long did it take you to get to the first $1 million in ARR?
That was a couple more years. So I think that must have been somewhere around 2019 or 2020. So definitely a longer time period. And I think the big difference there, there were a couple of pricing decisions along the way, but the big difference really is starting up more of a marketing and sales engine around, I would say, 2017 roughly. And then that just, accumulating over time. That's the part where, there was more proactive effort, so to say.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about that. Like what did you do differently in those 4 or 5 years to improve your marketing, get the word out more? It's great that people were stumbling upon the product and were hearing about it at a talk or whatever, but that's hard to scale and grow that to hundreds of customers. So what was the main growth channel in those years that helped you get to that first $1 million?
Right, and I think it's essentially the same in principle and what's still true today for us, which is ultimately focused on content, right? So like the database space is very technical. Essentially, it's very technical to the point that you want to have deep technical content, right? So if you do very high level content like fluff pieces, they don't really work in that space because people will see through it, especially when they are actually the database administrators or, like the people, the data platform engineers, as you would call them these days. I think what I always, because I'm an engineer myself, I always put an emphasis on quality, right? So we always were trying to say, if we produce content, it actually needs to be good content. And Manuel on our team, who's working on marketing, I think was always a bit frustrated with me because I was essentially saying, no, this is not good enough. Like it needs to be actual good technical content. And so what we started doing around that time, like 2017, was really putting out more blog posts. Initially, mainly written by myself because I felt, somebody needs to do this. And I already had other people working on engineering at the time. But I myself, wasn't essentially like, I was the main person who could write and wants to write for marketing purposes. And so starting out with that I think, then quickly turned also to growing a newsletter audience. So I think, if you produce content, the question is, how do you how do you make it something that actually sticks, right? So if you have a great content piece, and for us, for example, if it's on Hacker News, like news.ycombinator.com, that's a good place, for us to be in terms of getting traffic from engineers. But then if those people don't stick around, it doesn't help as much, right? I mean, we build our brand, but we don't actually get people that then try out the product. And so I think it's been really important for us to also think about how do we convert to newsletter signups, where we can then say, hey, here's a product, and we can kind of remind people that product exists. And that's really been, I think, the continuation of that marketing strategy.
So I just Googled PostgreSQL, and basically, first few pages, all you find is what is Postgres, right? How to get started. And I guess that's the type of content you're talking about that doesn't really help you a ton with your target audience. So can you give me an example of the type of content you were creating that you feel was more successful?
I mean, I'll give you one of the most successful pieces of content that, still is successful today, which is, so Postgres has, I'll go technical for a moment. So Postgres has different index types, right? So there's B-tree index, there's GIN index, there's GIST index, BRIN, blah, blah. So there's these different index types, and they're very specific to Postgres. And so that means, of course, if you search for it, right, it is a good term in that sense because it's specific. And so one of the things that I wrote a couple of years ago is a blog post on Postgres GIN indexes. GIN is, again, one index type. It stands for generalized inverted something tree, I think. And so not gin, the thing that you drink, but the gin that you store data in. And so I wrote a blog post, which I still think is a good blog post, which just walked through, the trade-offs and when you should use it, when you shouldn't use it, and what, like I think I referenced like GitLab had some public content around to what didn't work for them. And so I referenced that, right? And so that post is still performing well today from an SEO perspective. Like if you search for Postgres GIN index, you'll find your post somewhere on the first page. It's something that people, like I actually last week got somebody to say, hey, there's this issue in this post, you're saying this, but actually you probably mean this. And I was like, oh yeah, the person's right. And so it has become this reference piece, right? And so I think good content, like really good technical content for me, are things that people want to reference, where you can become the authoritative source, or at least in this case, I mean, the Postgres documentation is the authoritative source, but I think we can accompany that and give you things that the main actual Postgres documentation does not have, right? And so that's, for me, the good kind of content, but it's also really hard to write, which makes it challenging sometimes.
Yeah. So how long did it take before you felt that you were starting to see results from the content marketing efforts?
Definitely multiple months, if not years. So I think it's that's part of the problem why it's not a great strategy if you're trying to get revenue fast, right? So again, kind of comparing this with the funded strategy, right? If you just like, you got a bunch of VC funding and you got to get to big revenue fast, it's not a great strategy because it just takes time. So I think always do something else as well if you're trying to get revenue fast. But I would say at the very least, multiple months to actually get, good like content that actually is successful, and then probably multiple years to the point that we can say our organic search traffic, for example, is significant, and we know how to create that and how to create the content that supports that.
And is the experience mostly product led? Like, do people read a blog post and then some of them go on and sign up, try the product, and then become customers, or are you having to? Well, actually, I know you're doing it today, but back then, getting to that first million, were you also having to go and basically do demos and sell the product? Like, what was that general kind of that sales flow look like?
So I think, I mean, in our funnel, it really splits up. So there's some people that are self-serve. They just want to, like, there are people with, buying authority essentially that have a credit card they can use. And they have a problem that, let's say, their team lead solving, right? So maybe it's the infrastructure team lead. And so they don't necessarily need to see a demo. They're more interested in just getting the job done, so to say, right? Like they just know they have a problem, they want to solve it, they think pganalyze can help, so they sign up, swipe a credit card, and it's done. There's the other class of customers who are, I would say, more enterprisey. At least that's how I think about them in my mind, right? So there's something about either their company structure or the way that what they're used to that they want to buy in a different way, right? So they're used to talking to an enterprise sales team. They're used to their procurement process being complicated. They're used to things like security questionnaires. And that type of customer has always existed for us, but it's definitely gotten worse in a sense that we have more of these customers that need that level of attention. And so I think, sometimes these are the customers that make you more money, but not always. I think one of our biggest customer today, I think, came from a like swipe a credit card type experience initially. So they just signed up for like, I think at the time, $99 a month type plan. And today they're more than 100K a year type customer. And this was just by essentially expansion revenue, right? Like they had a small use case and then they had, a lot more database servers, which is our per seat essentially pricing. And so it's just like growing from, initial experience, somebody had success internally, right? Somebody became a champion for the product inside the company. And then that's how it grew to a much bigger contract for us.
Did you know who your ICP was at the time? Because it strikes me that Postgres is like a very accessible database. Like I could spin up an app this afternoon and have a Postgres database up and running, but probably I would never require pganalyze unless I was doing so well that, I needed to worry about, scale and performance and all these kinds of things in my database. So I'm guessing there are a lot of people out there using, Postgres who aren't your ideal customers. So how did you figure who that was? Like when you were doing your marketing, was there a certain type of person you were thinking of, you were targeting? And if not, like what was the process you went through to figure out who that ICP was?
I think it's funny when you say ICP. Like for me, there is, ICP, we're trying to measure this and we're trying to say, oh, this prospect is an ICP, and it just doesn't work. So it's really funny because we keep trying to make this work well so that we identify people in a funnel in an automated fashion. And it's really hard. But what does work well is I can tell you what's a good customer. So in a sense, I do know the ICP. It's just funny that it's measuring it is hard sometimes. Like in a sense, of course, this has shifted over time, but I think of like customers, like so Atlassian, for example, is one of the public case studies we have. And so, they have a very common setup, which a lot of bigger companies that we work with have, which is they have a central team that's supporting other teams, right? So there's like, in their case, there's like an infrastructure team. And I think, I don't actually know right now if they have a data team as well, but oftentimes in other companies, they have an infrastructure team and they have a data platform, data engineering team as well. And so these central teams then support other application teams. And so I think one of the most important insights for us was understanding that structure, right? So when we think about which customer, like for us, customers that have more database servers are more valuable. And so because they pay us more money because we charge per database server. And so what setup, like which kind of customers have 100 database servers? Now, it turns out if you're just, a startup starting out and you have, as you mentioned, your Postgres database, I mean, at the worst case, you have one badly performing Postgres database, but you don't have 100 badly performing Postgres databases. And so in that sense, right, like I think what we've seen over the years is that the teams, like the companies where it's really beneficial are these kind of setups where there are these central teams, they try to, kind of provide something to the other teams. And the motivation for them is ultimately they don't scale, right? Like they're 5 people, but there's 100 plus application engineers. And so what happens right now, if we're not in the picture, then these application engineers come to them with questions like, please optimize my query. What's the database doing? It's slow again, right? Like all these things that are kind of like centralized in this team that doesn't really scale. Like even if they are experts at what they're doing, it still doesn't scale. And so that's really what we found over the years by listening to our customers, right? By talking with them, by seeing who is buying, right? Like who's the person writing the check. And it usually wasn't the infrastructure side or data engineering side. So that's kind of how we evolved that ideal customer profile.